Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest, Peter Yastrow, a former CME member. Peter, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history in business and economics analytics?
Well, the fish I used to develop and market and execute trade strategies on the trading floor, but that was based on economic analysis, watching the Fed very closely and trying to come up with some economic forecasts. And then we would try to structure options trades using interest rate options to try to capture what we thought Fed policy would be going forward.
I love it. And you were also a frequent contributor on Bloomberg, Fox, isn't that right?
Yeah, they love to get the traders' opinions on those shows with the energy behind you. And I often got selected to, I think it was because I was not shy to speak my mind in front of a camera. So they chose me often, and I also got there very early, so they liked that about me too.
That's great. And Bo, I would love to hear a little bit about what you do here at Workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Bo Gerznich. I'm a organizational specialist, amongst other things, for workforce.com. So just trying to help our customer base best address all of their needs, especially when it comes to time attendance, scheduling, labor management, things like that.
Thank you guys for joining me today. So to kick things off, let's start just talking some general questions about the mandate itself. So Peter, what can you tell me about this vaccine mandate, or better known as the OSHA mandate?
Well, the legal part of it is very complicated, and the effect it's going to have on people and whether or not they get vaccinated now is also extremely complicated. It's behavioral science kind of stuff. But the economics is pretty simple and straightforward. And I think what we're going to see, and we should all expect, is that to totally be a geek about it, that we're going to see the supply of labor curve shift up. So what's going to happen is we're going to get less available supply of labor, and it's going to cost more money to get that labor in the door. That's really the simplest and most straightforward way to look at this. And I think that's the easiest of all the ramifications to understand about this mandate.
That's interesting. What do you think will happen if it is implemented or comes into law, so to speak?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a lot of companies that are afraid they're going to lose workers to their smaller competitors, because while there's about 30 to 40% of the country is not vaccinated, and a lot of those people do not have the luxury of telecommuting or using online services they have to be in person so they're going to want to move away from the big company and go to smaller companies.
Interesting.
And we're seeing, I guess, one of the things the National Truckers Association is pleading with the Biden's administration now, because they're afraid they're going to see a lot of their larger entities, who are often the big contributors to those kind of workers unions, and they're going to want to be. They're afraid they're going to lose truckers to the smaller competitors. So people, rather than stay with a firm that's over 100, are gonna look for employment opportunities in firms that are less than 100 people.
So correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but basically, the other big topic that's been at hand in the last couple of months is the labor shortage. A lot of people looking for more employees and not being able to meet those needs. And so the two things mixing together is we have less employees and we're laying off more employees, right? So the reality is that, with those smaller companies who are saying, hey, we aren't taking in the vaccine mandate, they kind of have a new labor market to try and tap into that, they're trying to handle the shortages, and they're thinking of creative ways to do it.
I think they might get some increase in labor, but I also think that in general you're going to see up, because people are going to want to keep them, and they're still going to be competing on them. I only see this exacerbating the supply chain shortages and the difficulty in getting employees. I'm sure there'll be some substitution effect, and you're right. Some of these smaller companies might find it's a little bit easier to hire people, but I think a lot of people are just gonna disappear and leave the workforce. And I don't anticipate it's gonna make it easier for anybody, but it'll just be particularly hard on the bigger companies.
So you think the individuals who are being affected by this vaccine mandate will become jaded in some way with the workforce and not try and join back in?
Well, I believe that I think they'll have to look for work. I don't know that anybody's got the luxury of not working, but whether or not they stay in the same industry, whether or not they can find employment easily, and it's not that fluid of a situation. So you're definitely going to get a dislocation, and you're going to see some disruptions, especially coming in now to the holiday season, and what's considered to be a busy time. So, which is why we're also seeing a couple of big workers representatives are now trying very hard to get the Biden administration to postpone this till after the holidays, because it's such a big, important time of year, and the disruption to, especially to truckers and retailers, is supposed to be so massive that seasonal workers, to add on to what you're saying. I mean, seasonal workers, they work for large companies. They come in this time of year, go to work at the malls and the shopping centers, and those companies all have over 100 employees. So I doubt anyone who's reticent about the vaccine is going to get the vaccine just so they can work the holiday season. They're probably going to opt out this year. So I think it's going to really make the holidays difficult, and this next few months very difficult.
Amber had a great question that she dropped in the chat. She said, the question's still out there. Who's going to be in charge of covering the cost of these tests? What do you think, Peter? Do you think that this is something that is going to be provided by the government, individual employee, or businesses?
Well, that'll be an interesting development. I think it's going to be business by business. If I'm an owner and I'm adamant that everybody should get vaccinated, and they would rather do the weekly testing, then I might be willing to let them do that if they pay for their own testing. And other companies, I think, are going to be really eager to help their employees, and they're willing to bear the brunt of those costs. But and then of course the other issue is that OSHA is not a very big organization. And they've already expressed there's no way they're going to be uniformly able to make sure that everyone's following the rules on this mandate. So, it's gonna be interesting. I don't know that it's gonna be enforced easily or fairly. And you're gonna see a lot of corporations, a lot of companies, a lot of CEOs be put on the hot seat. I mean, I'm not only just sympathetic to the employees who don't want to get vaccinated and are upset about this, but their bosses and their managers who have to answer. Suddenly they're going to be suddenly worried about things like employee morale, and so they have to balance, because they can't just pay the testing for everybody, and they certainly can't pay these fines that are being levied. Right. So they're going to have no choice but to basically sell out their employees, which I think is a horrible development, but it's going to happen.
Well, the opposite end of this too, cost is one thing, but the logistics of weekly testing on an employee population that is greater than just a regular set of office workers. That's a lot of time and resources that goes into a weekly qualification, essentially, where it just goes back to zero come Monday, and this isn't a process that we need to manage on a week-to-week basis. That can create quite the overhead cost.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. I mean, it's a direct cost to business. It's a direct cost, which in my assessment, I look at as a increased cost of labor. So when I
Yeah.
say the supply curve has shifted, that's part of the reason, because if you want to keep all your employees and they don't all want to be vaccinated, then it costs more to keep those employees because you got to test them. So
Right.
it's definitely going to be painful, and unfortunately, with the supply chain already being somewhat disrupted, this is only going to exacerbate the situation.
So continuing off that thought, how is COVID and the policies that our administration is implementing affecting the labor market or even the U.S. economy as a whole?
Well, we saw a GDP number today that was slow, and I can imagine we're going to be, below trend growth. It's just, and it creates tremendous uncertainty. And when you have,
Right.
there's a lot of research that's been done. The Brookings Institute did a big research effort in 2019, and it said the most important and critical part of business growth is certainty versus uncertainty of the political climate. So we're going to have this very, very uncertain period going forward. Will the mandate be, upheld? Will the courts throw it out? Will people actually, give in, so to speak, and go get vaccinated? Or will they take this as their Aaron go bragh moment and say, don't tread on me. I'm not giving in. I'm going to remain unvaccinated. So it's going to be it's going to definitely hit growth hard, because everybody's going to be worried about the uncertainty, and it just makes planning and decision making and trying to do anything long term almost impossible.
That's really interesting. So what do you think are some stats or trends you're seeing between the market and the economy that maybe a business owner, an operator, or manager should know about?
Well, whether your client or customers or providers are small, let's say under 100, or whether they're larger than 100, it really doesn't matter, because maybe their supplier or their customer is a company that's over 100. So while it might not affect any of your direct clients or customers, it probably affects them indirectly, which will then affect you directly. So and once again, we have this chain of inner working, blockchain, the inner working connections, the connectivity of our economy. It's all disrupted. And part of the reasons what we've seen lately is, and the reason why we're seeing all these problems from the ports and from the shelves and the prices, it's all because we are such a finely tuned machine that all interconnects. And now all of a sudden we've thrown sand into the gears, and shortages are popping up and higher prices are popping up. I mean, that's just what happens. If you look at, what's interesting is if you look at cattle prices and stuff, they're actually really, really low.
Right.
Because there are some industries where, believe it or not, the prices of things go down when there's disruption, but that's very, very rare and not going to be for us. For us, we can imagine less business, less planning, less projects, less aggressiveness by decision makers and leaders, and much more higher prices in the short run, at least. And then because of that uncertainty, the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to sit on their hands. They anticipate already that people are going to be slow to make any big capital expenditures. They're going to be slow to do much of any kind of business growth or take on any new projects. So I would imagine the Federal Reserve is going to be on hold for at least the rest of 2022. Even though we're seeing inflationary pressures building, they're going to remain on hold. And for those of you who like to invest in stocks, as long as interest rates are this low, there's no reason to worry about the stock market. So
that's interesting. So we do have a poll question, actually, that we asked our audience, and feel free to fill it out. We still have some answers coming in slowly but surely, but we're wondering, has your company enforced a vaccine mandate? And it seems like so far, based off the answers that have been dialed in, 82% are saying no, not yet. So that being said, what are the next steps in terms of the rollout of this mandate, if it's even able to be enforced?
I would imagine that we're seeing a lot of protests, and you're seeing the protests in very interesting groups that many considered heroes and patriots: the first responders, the firemen, the frontline workers, who all have worked for the last year and a half through the pandemic with no vaccine available. And now you're telling them, well, you lose your job if you don't get the vaccine. And I would imagine a lot of them also have natural immunity if they've been on the front line this whole time. And the stories, whether they're anecdotal or the stats back them up, I can't really say for sure.
Right.
But it sure does get the attention of the nation when you see nurses and doctors marching down the streets of New York saying, we don't want to be forced. And I think for a lot of people, that is the issue. It's not necessarily that they're anti-vaccine, but they're anti-mandate. And I wouldn't be surprised if they duck and cover under the, everyone wants us to put it off till after the new year. So we're going to be, we're going to show some Christmas spirit and we're going to postpone this. And then, it gives them some political cover. I'm hoping that's what happens because I don't know that it's going to have the result of getting everyone vaccinated as much as it's just going to have the result of costing us more jobs and more at the stores.
So Paul actually had a really good question in the chat. He said how, you did mention that the Biden administration is to delay enforcement until after the holiday period. Is there any insight that you know of as to when or where that's heading?
I only know what's publicly available. I don't have any insight, but there's two very important groups who are pushing on it. The retailers, I think it's the National Retail Association, which are huge contributors to political parties. So they have they carry a big stick. And then also the truckers, and they also have a big union and carry a lot of weight. So I know those two groups specifically have been really, really eager to have especially for truckers, who one of their arguments is that we're in a cab of a truck by ourselves. Why do we have to be vaccinated? And and as usual, there's always these people who talk about their specific situation and point out how it's not really that crucial to the health of the nation whether or not they're vaccinated. So why should their company of thousands of employees spread out all over the country have to follow up on this mandate?
Yeah, I mean, we have some questions that a lot of people in the chat are asking for. Those that are working remote, what do you think the requirements of the vaccine mandate will look like for them? Remote work has become so prevalent over the last year and a half that it seems almost a vaccine mandate seems interesting, to say the least. What are your thoughts on that?
It appears that anybody who can work remotely is being given the opportunity to continue to work remotely, and they don't have to get vaccinated and they don't have to be tested, at least based on what their company is telling them.
Got it.
Whether or not the administration says, well, no, they still have to be tested, even though they're remote workers, will be very interesting. And that's the kind of draconian things that we they could force it. I mean, if it's a mandate, then you got to prove everyone's vaccinated, even if they're working remotely. I mean, you'd hope common sense would prevail, and they'd say, well, you're working remotely. It's not really important that you get vaccinated or not. But if OSHA says, well, no, you still got to provide proof that everybody's vaccinated or tested, then I think you really got a mess on your hands. What I've read, it's not clear that remote employees are going to be somehow able to opt out. Not the word I have read yet, but I'm sure that it's such an obvious problem with the way the mandate is being issued that it's got to come back to the surface.
So I guess it's more so
For
about
sure.
the population of your workforce and less about how does that workforce, interact with the rest of the society. If my 100-person workforce is all remote, that's a lot different than 100 people in a grocery store.
100%. And I think you're right on the topic there, because the reason why they're doing this through OSHA, through workplace, is because it allowed them to get around all kinds of constitutional questions and slam this thing in place as fast as they could. And, so the reason they did it is to get everyone vaccinated. The reason they chose this route is because it really hits people hard and they have a lot of power in the purse.
Right.
But, so, are they going to be quick to give people exemptions because they work remotely? Maybe not, because, as pointed out, we're trying to get everyone vaccinated so that when they go to the store, or when they go out in public, or they go here and there, they can be vaccinated. So
Right.
we'll see. I mean, I think you make a good point, and I think that's why the administration will probably dig their heels in and say, no, everyone's got to be tested and everyone's got to be vaccinated, and they're not going to give but isn't that horrible for someone who owns a company and you do a lot of remote, you're the guy who has a company and your whole workforce is remote, and now you've got to be the bad guy. You got to be the Grinch who steals Christmas. It's just, it's very, very
David.
harsh.
David just asked something interesting in the chat, which I think I'd like to address, which is that they are a staffing firm and they have a lot of temp workers going to different client locations. Something that I've seen through our clients is it's less for them about the staff firm themselves and more about the locations that they're going to. Are there mandates? And if so, what kind of proof do we need to have? Because if I'm a staffing firm and I'm trying to staff certain locations, some will have different criteria than others, and they're finding that some of those is a vaccine and some aren't, and that significantly impacts who I can staff at those locations, right?
Yeah, and I'm afraid that the rules are so vague at this point on a lot of those issues, and they also differ from state to state quite a bit. And then the response of the state legislature is quite different. So what it's going to do is create a huge amount of uncertainty. I would imagine that being a firm that staffs people, they got a tough 6 months or a year ahead of them, because it's just how are they going to? It differs from state to state, and it might even differ from county and town to town.
Yeah.
So
we actually next week we do actually have a webinar focused with a prominent COO of a staffing agency and how he has come across solutions in attracting and retaining employees. So for those that are interested, feel free to tune in next week. We do have a topic that will cover this exactly. So, and Peter, I wanted to emphasize Sarah's question a little bit in the chat. Being a self-proclaimed history buff as yourself, is there another time in recent decades where a similar mandate was implemented?
Well, not through OSHA is the thing that makes this so unique. Going through OSHA's had a hard time with vaccines in the past. There's been a couple, and there's been some other, there was. And they always fail. They always. There's a bunch of Supreme Court cases where it almost always fails. I think the Sibelius is the one that they bring up all the time, and so I don't. I'm sure there's probably one, and I'm overlooking it, but I don't remember ever seeing this kind of government. I mean, it's pretty heavy-handed. I mean, it really is, and And I don't know. I don't really know what if they expect this to get the vaccination rate up or not. I mean, obviously they think it will. So let's assume it will. But I can't remember a time. I mean, there was a time back in where they took over steel unions and they took over iron forges for war and things.
Interesting.
But I'm not sure. I'm afraid I would have to do a little digging to answer that question a little better. It's a good question.
Yeah, definitely. That was a great question, Sarah. You mentioned, Peter, how there will be a challenge with keeping track of individual employees' statuses. Bo, do you think that there's any technology or any help that technology can provide in tracking the statuses with individual employees, teams, location?
Well, I mean, I guess my first advice would be you can't track it on paper. Especially with larger workforces and larger location sets, that can't be something that's in the back of my mind that I know, Billy's vaccinated and so is this location in Portland. So we can put them together. As you create, at least, from our perspective as a scheduling software, you need to be able to schedule individuals who meet the criteria for the jobs that you're scheduling them for, right? And so collecting that data and then creating rules in place that will prevent you from scheduling people who cannot work those jobs, that's going to be your fail-safe, so that you don't have to manage this from a high level and your scheduling managers aren't hitting this at all, not privy to this information. There's questions about HIPAA and what information you're privy to. If they can't work a shift, then they're not available for it, right? So that at least from an hourly wage perspective and from a staffing perspective, that's going to be the biggest advice I've seen so far.
Definitely. That's interesting. We talked a little bit about the inflation, Peter. What do you think the vaccine mandate will further decrease the available pool of workers and contribute to the ongoing inflation problem in the U.S.?
Yeah, I'm being an economics geek going way back. I'm always hesitant to say inflation in these times, but we're definitely seeing prices going up. But there's a little, just allow my druthers. We're going to see upward pressure on prices for a little while longer. What I fear, and I make the bad joke, it's like jumping out of an airplane. I don't mind jumping out of an airplane. It's hitting the ground that's the problem. It's kind of the same thing with it. Inflation isn't so bad if it's not too much. Your price of your houses go up. Most of the countries got debt, whether you're a student with student loans or you're a homeowner. So small amounts of inflation aren't actually that bad for the economy or for most of us in general, because our obligations stay the same and our assets are growing growing. So we come out ahead if there's a very limited amount of what they would almost dictate as healthy inflation. The problem is when the rubber meets the road and finally you can't afford these things anymore, and then you have the deflation or depression that follows. If for those of you who are old enough to remember back when the housing market they cut interest rates in the housing market and mortgages became abundant, everybody's house started going up and up and everyone was buying houses and we're all buying houses and it was great. And you'd buy a house and 6 months later you'd refinance your house. Well, that was an inflation and everyone loved it until the supply caught up and all of a sudden the house prices stopped going up and then they actually started coming back down. And that's when the pain set in. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens. The bigger issue, I think, is the dislocation of the labor market. I mean, and that's bothered me. That's bothered me since COVID first reared its ugly head. I mean, people are being told stay home, don't work. And then they're like, well, they can't pay rent. So like, oh, well, we got a solution. No one has to pay rent anymore. And well, I owe money to the bank. And it's like, oh, well, the banks can't collect on that anymore. And it's like a train, just every car is just ramming into the one in front of it as it falls off the track. So, hopefully, I wish we could just find a new approach where we didn't have to just stick our finger in the pie here and try to fix COVID through our workplace and our markets. I wish we could just talk intelligently and explain to people what the positives and negatives are of getting vaccinated and let them do it on their own volition, as opposed to going through our marketplace like this, because the unintended consequences are going to be quite massive and very painful. You might be willing to get the vaccine, and you might be willing to, work in an environment, and you might be willing to work 12-hour shifts, and it doesn't matter, because it still hits you when you go to the store, and it still hits you when you go to buy your kids toys for Christmas, and it's just pain. It's a painful way to implement a vaccine, that's for sure.
So going off the idea of a smaller labor market, Bo, what are your thoughts on managing a workforce with even less hands-on staff?
Yeah, so especially with smaller staff companies, you're going to see, and we have seen, a lot of managers, salaried individuals having to bear a lot of the burden of, short and smaller markets for labor. So a lot of people are, if they're a restaurant, they're waiting their own tables or working the cashiers, just basically picking up wherever they need to be picked up at. And so what that means is that their jobs that they were doing beforehand are now either not being done or being done in overtime, after hours, things like that. And so as we try and manage our time, I think the larger companies, they're going to figure it out. They've got the resources to put more effort into automating. We need to find solutions that whatever processes we can automate, we're doing it. And we're doing it in a simple way.
Right.
We're making sure that if there's something that used to be a manual process or used to be someone's job that we can automate. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go down that route because we have a smaller workforce. We need to make sure we're competitive with the larger companies who are going down this road. And so, we need to keep up.
So that being said, Peter, how does this mandate affect companies under 100 staff? I mean, you covered it a little bit already, but
well, what's really interesting is if you're a procurement person, a hiring person for a large company, and you've had to let go of people because of the vaccine mandate, and now you need to find people who you can get, you're going to go to those smaller companies and poach them. You're going to go to small, people who work for smaller companies who are vaccinated are going to be excellent hires for you. So there might be a trend to go out, anyone who's vaccinated is now going to be sought after by a large company who's over 100 people trying to stay, on the up and up with this mandate. And so it's really, so again, you think you're safe because you're a small company, you're under 100, you don't have to worry about it. And then you find out 7 or 8 of your best employees were all hired away so it's definitely going to put upward pressure on your wages just because you're under 100. And you think, well, there's going to be a lot of people coming from these big companies who aren't vaccinated. So they're coming my way. So I've got more people coming to work for me. And it's like, yeah, but those companies need to refill who they lost. So any of your employees who are vaccinated could be hired away. So there's going to be 2 distinct migration patterns here. Vaccinated people going towards large companies and unvaccinated people being forced to go to the small companies, assuming that they're not willing to get vaccinated, which seems to be the case. Again, not because they're in any way anti-science or anti-vaccines, just because they don't like mandates. So you're going to see a two-way flow. Vaccinated people will go towards will be hired by the big companies. Unvaccinated people will be moving towards the under 100, under threshold companies. So the interesting fact, though, is that companies over 100 often have the resources to complain to the government loudly enough to be heard. So we'll see very quickly how these migration patterns affect the labor. But I would imagine that more people are going to leave. It's going to cause some disruptions for the big companies. So
we have a poll question for this one. which unfortunately we did have a bit of a typo with, but it seems like for when asking the audience how many employees does your company have, most people are over 100. And it seems like, as you know, even now more people are filling out the poll question itself, more people are filling out over 100 staff. So I find it interesting to see if anybody has any ideas in the chat and what they've done to help retain employees. Bo, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that matter, in fact.
Yeah, retention's an interesting thing. We always try and go the approach of, when you're looking at your workforce and you're trying to judge how you're going to retain staff, you need qualitative information and quantitative information. So from the qualitative side, like, are we getting feedback? Do employees feel heard? Are we proactively being a part of their working experience so that we can gauge from a qualitative perspective how they're feeling about their job? And then from a quantitative perspective, how are we pulling in data that's relevant to whether or not they might be a flight risk? There's a lot of really good data that we can pull in and understand. Attendance, some of the best data we can get, if people are consistently late or they're showing, a negative trend line in their tardiness or their inclination to take time off. That's very large red flags from our perspective on whether we have flight risks or not. And so I would say the best thing you can do in that regard is get that information, whether that's the qualitative or quantitative side, hopefully both. And then you can try and make adjustments according to that information. So
following up that poll question, even, why do you think it's important for companies of all sizes to adopt, technological modern advances, so to speak?
Yeah, I would say, again, it comes down to the automation of it, getting feedback from, looked like we had the vast majority of people at 100, 150 probably have, 3 or 4 HR professionals in that size. And so if we're doing weekly check-ins with our entire workforce, that's going to be a big strain on time. Do we have that time available or can we automate that process? If I'm checking time cards for tardiness and trying to, analyze trend lines, that's someone's whole job, right? So leveraging tools that allow you to get that information without having to hire data scientists or anything, that's going to be, my biggest advice.
There is a lot of questions in the chat about differentiating how the mandate will be implemented or rolled out if you have multiple locations, however, less than 100 employees per location. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, again, it's pretty hard to get a handle it's a legal question. And it's very hard when you start reading through the mandate and the language and then how it interferes state by state. It also will affect, because some states already have some mandates in place too. So it would have, unfortunately, we're not going to have that answer unless we know where everyone actually is located. I mean, what state are you in? Is your other location in the same state or is it in a different state? I mean, these kind of things. But my gut, based on the way they're handling the truckers, and they're expecting the truckers to all be vaccinated, even though they're individuals, right? In effect, a truck is kind of like your own little office of one, and they expect them to all get vaccinated. So I would imagine that even if you have only 20 at a location or 10 at a location, they're going to expect you all to get vaccinated because they're expecting the truckers to get vaccinated. Another point that I think is really important. If I was, I would want to talk to my employees and get the feedback from my employees. Maybe they're willing to get the vaccine if I pay them a bonus. And I think that is really an opportunity for everybody right now to try to look at this from a different point of view. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to lose my great employees, why don't you pull them in? Why don't we have a little meeting and say, how much is it going to cost? How much? If I give you $1,000 Christmas bonus, will you get the vaccine?
Yeah.
$2,000, and we could really quantify where we're at here, because to lose an employee, and I'm sure you have a lot of information on this, but to lose an employee and then hire someone new and train them and get them up and running, that's very difficult and very expensive.
Yeah.
Right. So,
It takes a lot of money
if I was a
too.
CEO or a COO or a high personnel, someone in human resources, the first thing I think I'd do is try to determine how long it would take me to refill a job if I lost it, and quantify that and then try to offer some sort of incentives to my employees who don't want to get vaccinated. Of course, you run the risk that everybody's going to claim they're not vaccinated, so they can get the bonus too. But let's hope that doesn't happen.
It seems like there's a lot of gray area, not surprisingly, but a lot of gray area with the mandate itself and kind of what's been rolled out thus far, state and federally. Do you think that this is something that will go to the Supreme Court?
I think it's if they try to enforce the mandate, there's no doubt it's going to see, I don't know if it'll make its way all the way to the Supreme Court, because it might come down to the fact that it can be decided in a lower court, but it's definitely a significant issue. I mean, this is huge. And when you think, okay, it's a crisis. We have a crisis in this country. They declared COVID as a crisis. So therefore they're really pushing on what are considered our personal freedoms and liberties. What other crises could come up? So I think you gotta definitely expect this to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is a lot of companies,
no doubt,
depending on where they're located, are saying, you know what, come and get us. We're not doing it. We're fighting back. In-N-Out Burger in California said, nope, we're not doing it. And that's in California, where you don't have any cover of government at all there.
Yeah.
But, in a state where I see someone mention Texas and then there's Florida, those are really, those states have tend to been a lot more about the personal freedom and the independence of the worker, and they're anti-mandate. They're not anti-vaccine, but they're anti-mandate. So it'll be interesting to see what happens state by state. Just as we saw when COVID first hit, some states shut down and others didn't. Some states have mask mandates and others don't. Some are enforcing the rules, and where we live, they're enforcing the rule pretty dramatically in a lot of places. Some places are much more open, and it's really incredible. I've traveled back and forth from Chicago to Florida several times in the last year, and the rules are incredibly different, and the attitude is incredibly different. So I
definitely
we'll see what happens. But again, the bottom line is we don't know. We don't know. The Biden administration doesn't know. No CEOs know. No CFOs know. No lawyers know. Nobody in the courts knows. We don't know. It's just a huge question mark, and that's why. That's why the only thing I can be sure of is the economy is going to slow down, and the prices are going to be seeing upward pressure, and the labor market's going to be hurt a little bit. Those things I know, because the effects of uncertainty on business are very easy to understand.